At this point, based on what happened last night, do you know anything better about it now than you did last night?
No. They've got people everywhere looking for them. You can hear the helicopters are there, but they haven't seen anything, and it's crazy. And it's been since 9 o'clock last night, and I really thought that when it got daylight they would find them just in a heartbeat, but they haven't.
Was there anything about the demeanor of the man that gives you concern?
No, in fact, when he made me get out of the car, I tried to get my children. I just begged him, please let me take them. And he said no, he didn't have time because they were in car seats and it was going to take time for me to get them out of the car seat. And he just told me, he said, but I won't hurt them. And he just took off. But he had a gun, and my big thing is they were screaming, hollering, crying. And
picture this. It is 9 o'clock at night in Union, South Carolina, a small mill town of about 10,000 people, roughly 2 hours from Charlotte. Most people are home, winding down their Tuesday evening. There is a knock at Shirley McCloud's door. She opens it to find a young woman, disheveled, clearly distressed, tears already on her face. The woman says her name is Susan. She says she has just been carjacked. A black man, she says, jumped into her car at a red light near Monarch Mill, put a gun to her side, told her to shut up and drive. After several miles, she says, he stopped the car and ordered her out. She begged him to let her get her boys out of the back seat. He told her he didn't have time. He drove away with them still inside. Shirley McCloud called the police immediately. What followed over the next 9 days was one of the largest child abduction searches in South Carolina history. More than 100 law enforcement officers and volunteers combed the area along Highway 49, where Susan said she had been carjacked. The Adam Walsh Foundation,
the organization founded after the abduction and murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, got involved. Yellow ribbons were tied around trees on Main Street in Union. Parents across the country held their children tighter. People were sending tips to police from multiple states. And every single day, Susan Smith sat in front of cameras and begged the carjacker to bring her boys home. Michael was 3 years old. Alex was 14 months. They were already dead. They had been dead since the night Susan knocked on Shirley McCloud's door. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are covering the Susan Smith case. And I want to say something before we go any further, because this case has layers that I do not think get discussed properly when it comes up in true crime conversation. Yes, it is about a mother who killed her children, but it is also about a fabricated racial accusation that sent law enforcement after hundreds of innocent black men in a community that was already racially tense. It is about a childhood that was defined by abandonment and abuse. It is about a system of people who missed every warning sign. And it is about a 2024 parole hearing that most people do not know happened. By the end of this video, you are going to understand every part of this story. Stay with me. I always start with the victims, every single time. And in this case, I want to make sure we spend real time on Michael and Alex before we get into anything else. Because in 30 years of coverage of this case, these two boys have sometimes been reduced to a statistic or a backdrop. That is not happening here. Michael Daniel Smith was born on October 10th, 1991. He was 3 years old at the time of his death, a fully formed little person with his own personality, his own preferences, his own way of moving through the world. By all accounts, he was a bright, energetic boy. His father, David Smith, would
describe him as curious and playful. Alexander Tyler Smith, called Alex, was born on August 5th, 1993. He was 14 months old. He was still a baby in every meaningful sense. He had barely started to develop language. He was in that stage where everything is new and everything is fascinating, and you were just beginning to understand that you are a person in a world full of other persons. Both boys were strapped into their car seats on the evening of October 25th, 1994, when their mother drove to John D. Long Lake. When she let the car roll down the boat ramp and into the water, investigators would later determine, using cameras placed in a similar vehicle, that it took approximately 6 minutes for the car to sink below the surface. 6 minutes. The water came in through the vents first, then rose slowly. Both boys were still strapped in their seats when the car was found 9 days later. The boys were found dangling upside down in their car seats. One tiny hand was pressed against a window.
I need to just stop for a second here, because I think it is important to actually sit with that image. Not for shock value, but because I think when cases like this get covered, the focus moves so quickly to the lie and the investigation that we lose track of what actually happened to these two little kids in that car. Michael was 3. He was old enough to be confused. He was old enough to be scared. And Alex was 14 months old. He would not have understood anything except that something was very wrong. I find it genuinely impossible to move past those 6 minutes without acknowledging what they mean. Inside the car with the boys, investigators also found Susan's wedding dress and family photo albums. Lead prosecutor Tommy Pope said Susan had basically packed up that whole part of her life and put it in that lake. Whatever her state of mind that night, she had brought with her the physical objects that represented the life she was walking away from. Michael and Alex deserved everything. They deserved the chance to grow up. They deserved a mother who chose them. They did not get either.
Now, let me tell you about Susan, because I think to understand what happened on October 25, 1994, you have to understand what had been happening to Susan Smith for the 23 years before it. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina. Her parents were Harry Vaughn and Linda Harrison. When Susan was 6 years old, her father, Harry, died by suicide. 6 years old. That is the age when children are starting school, learning to read, figuring out how the world works. And Susan's foundational experience of it included losing her father to suicide at an age when she could not possibly have processed what that meant. Her mother, Linda, eventually remarried. Her stepfather was Beverly Russell, a local businessman who would later gain prominence in South Carolina's Republican Party and as a state leader of the Christian Coalition. To the outside world, Beverly Russell was a respectable, church-going conservative. Behind closed doors, he began sexually abusing Susan when she was a teenager. Both Susan and Russell have stated that the sexual relationship continued until approximately 6 months before the murders. I want to be really clear about something here, because I think this gets misrepresented in coverage of this case. The fact that Susan Smith was sexually abused by her stepfather from adolescence does not explain or justify what she did to her children. Nothing explains or justifies that. But it is an absolutely essential part of understanding who Susan Smith was as an adult. The anxious attachments, the pattern of seeking male approval at any cost, the inability to cope with abandonment, the repeated suicide attempts. These are not random character flaws. They are documented consequences of documented abuse that started when she was a child and continued into her adulthood. Acknowledging that is not sympathy. It is accuracy. At age 13, Susan attempted suicide for the first time. After graduating high school in 1989, she attempted suicide a second time, after a married man she was involved with ended their relationship.
She married David Smith in 1991. She was 19 and already 2 months pregnant with Michael when they wed. Their marriage was volatile and unstable from the beginning. Friends described both of them as immature. The pattern was accusations of adultery, public scenes, separation, reconciliation, and then the cycle starting again. By 1994, they were in the process of divorcing. Susan worked as a secretary at Conso Products, the largest employer in Union, owned by a man named J. Carey Findlay. And it was at Conso that she met and began an affair with J. Carey Findlay's son, a 27-year-old man named Tom.
Tom Findlay was everything Susan Smith felt she was not. He was 27, educated, he had graduated from Auburn University, and the son of the most powerful businessman in Union. He was considered the most eligible bachelor in town. He drove a nice car, he had a cottage on his father's estate. He represented a different life entirely from the Milltown existence Susan had grown up in. They had been seeing each other on and off throughout 1994. And Susan had convinced herself, prosecutors argued this at trial, that Tom Findlay was her way out, her future, the person who could give her the life she had always wanted. On October 17, 1994, 8 days before the night at John D. Long Lake, Tom Findlay sent Susan a letter, a 2-page word-processed letter, formal-looking, like a business document. The letter was mostly kind. Tom wrote that she was a great person. He said he was proud she had gone back to night school. He said she had endearing qualities. And then he got to the part that Susan could not get past. There are some things about you that aren't suited for me. And yes, I am speaking about your children. He also wrote, you will without a doubt make some lucky man a great wife. But unfortunately, it won't be me. 8 days after that letter arrived, Michael and Alex were dead.
Now, I want to be really careful here, because I've seen this case discussed in a way that makes it sound like Tom Findlay is responsible for what Susan did. He is not. He sent a breakup letter. People send breakup letters. That is not a provocation for murder. But what the letter does is reveal the motive. And the motive is not that Susan desperately wanted a man. The motive is that Susan could not tolerate abandonment. After a lifetime of losing people, her father to suicide, her marriage falling apart, a series of relationships that ended, Tom Findlay's rejection landed in a place that had been accumulating damage for 23 years. That is not an excuse. It is the context that prosecutors themselves argued at trial. And without that context, the crime makes even less sense than it already does. Lead prosecutor Tommy Pope would say 30 years later, Susan Smith made a horrible decision that somehow, if she didn't have kids, she was going to somehow be with this guy that was really just blowing her off. She had convinced herself, based on what he wrote, that somehow she would be with him. On October 23rd, 2 days before the murders, Susan drove to Tom's cottage on the Findlay estate and tried to get him to reconsider. He did not change his position. She left. 2 days later, she drove to John D. Long Lake.
Susan Smith later confessed that on the evening of October 25, 1994, she had originally planned to take her own life. She drove to John D. Long Lake with Michael and Alex in the back seat, both strapped into their car seats in her 1990 burgundy Mazda Protege. She said she intended to drive the car into the lake with all 3 of them in it. But when she got to the boat ramp and sat in the dark by that lake, she said she could not go through with it. She got out of the car. And then she did something that she would spend the rest of her life being judged for. Instead of getting her boys out of the car, she released the emergency brake and let the car roll down the ramp and into the water. She watched it go. She stood on that boat ramp and watched the car sink. Investigators later established it took approximately 6 minutes to go fully under.
Susan stood there for all of that, and then walked to Shirley McCloud's house and started knocking on the door. 6 minutes. I keep coming back to that number. 6 minutes is long enough to change your mind. It is long enough to wade in after them. It is long enough to call 911. It is long enough to do almost anything other than stand there and watch. And I do not say that to be cruel about Susan Smith's state of mind that night. I say it because I think it is important to understand that this was not over in an instant. It took 6 full minutes for that car to go under the surface.
And in those 6 minutes, nothing changed, except that 2 little boys ran out of time. When she knocked on Shirley McCloud's door, she had her story ready. A black man, a gun, a red light near Monarch Mill, a carjacking, her boys taken. The description she gave was specific. A black man in his late 20s to early 30s, wearing a dark knit toboggan hat and a plaid shirt. He had bad body odor, she said. His voice was nervous. He told her to shut up and drive. She gave that specific description to investigators. She sat in interview rooms and repeated it. She went on the Today Show. She went on Good Morning America. She sat beside David Smith, the man she was in the process of divorcing, and together they begged for their boys. David did not know the truth. He was genuinely desperate. He was searching. He was grieving children he did not yet know were dead.
And Susan sat next to him and cried and looked into the cameras and said, "As a mother, it's only a natural instinct to protect your children, and I can't imagine what those boys are going through." The boys were at the bottom of a lake. She knew exactly what they were going through. Here is something I find genuinely fascinating about this case. And by fascinating, I mean it in the way where you end up with a lot of respect for the investigators involved, because they started doubting Susan Smith almost immediately. The traffic light she described at Monarch Mill, the one where she said the carjacker jumped in, investigators discovered that light operated on a timer at night. It would not have stayed red long enough for the scenario she described to play out the way she said it did. That was noticed within days. No one in the area matching the description had been seen. No vehicle matching the Mazda had been spotted driving the route she described. The search of Highway 49 found nothing. The geography of her story had gaps that could not be explained away.
And Susan's behavior in interviews was raising flags. FBI agent David Espy testified at trial that when he told her during an interview that her boys were calling out to her to tell the truth, she backed into a corner of the room and began acting as if she were crying, but no actual tears could be seen. SLED agent David Caldwell testified that he told Susan directly, "They were screaming, weren't they? That's why you killed them." Susan left the room shouting that she could not believe they suspected her, but she did not deny it in the direct way an innocent person would. The person who broke it open was Sheriff Howard Wells. Wells had known Susan personally since she was a teenager. He had watched her grow up in this town. And on November 3, 1994, 9 days after the boys disappeared, he sat across from her in an interview room and told her directly her story did not hold up. The light, the geography, the missing evidence, all of it. He told her it was time to tell the truth. They were sitting knee to knee in a local Baptist church when Susan Smith finally confessed. She signed her confession at 5:05 p.m. that afternoon.
Divers went to John D. Long Lake that evening. The Mazda was found. Michael and Alex were brought up from the water still in their car seats. Remember I mentioned at the very beginning that Susan ran to Shirley McCloud's house after the car went into the lake? Remember how specific and immediate her story was? The black man, the gun, the red light? Investigators had that level of specificity working against her from day one. A genuinely traumatized person who just watched a stranger drive away with her children
does not typically have a perfectly detailed description ready within minutes. That was one of the first things that felt wrong to the people in that room. Sheriff Howard Wells held a press conference that night and told the nation, Susan Smith has been charged with 2 counts of murder. The same woman who had sat beside him at press conferences for 9 days asking for the safe return of her children. I want to say something about Sheriff Wells here, because I think he deserves it. This was a man who knew Susan personally. He had watched her grow up, and when the evidence pointed to her, he did not look away. He sat across from her in that room and did what he had to do. That is genuinely hard. And I think it is part of why this case ultimately got the resolution it did, because the person at the center of it had enough integrity to follow the evidence wherever it went. The trial and what David Smith said on that stand is coming up next. And then we get to the 2024 parole hearing, which I promise you is something you need to hear in full. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Stay with me. We are almost there. Susan Smith's trial began on July 10th,
1995, 8 months after the boys died. 9 men and 3 women were seated on the jury, all from Union County. Prosecutor Tommy Pope announced before the trial that he would seek the death penalty. Susan's defense attorneys were David Brooke and Judy Clark, both of whom are considered among the best capital defense lawyers in the country. Judy Clark would later represent the Unabomber, the Olympic Park bomber, and the Aurora theater shooter. She is not someone who loses cases easily. The prosecution's case was built on 2 central pillars. First, the physical evidence, the car, the boys, the confession, the forensics. Second, the motive. Prosecutor Pope read Tom Findlay's letter to the jury in full, every word, including the line about her children being the reason the relationship could not continue. The defense did not contest the facts. David Brooke told the jury from the outset, Susan Smith killed her children. That is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether she deserves to die. Brooke presented the full history of Susan's life, the father's suicide, the sexual abuse by her stepfather Beverly Russell, the repeated failed relationships, the documented depression, the 2 suicide attempts. He argued she had been failed by every system and every adult who should have protected her, and that executing her would be adding another layer of punishment to a woman who had already been damaged beyond recognition by the time she was old enough to make her own choices. Beverly Russell, the stepfather who had abused her from adolescence and continued a sexual relationship with her into adulthood, actually testified for the defense. He sat on that stand and admitted what he had done. He asked the jury for mercy for his stepdaughter.
That moment, Beverly Russell on the stand, admitting to years of sexual abuse of his stepdaughter in front of a jury, is one of the most remarkable things in this entire case, and I don't think it gets enough attention. Here is a man who held positions of moral authority, Republican Party official, Christian coalition leader, admitting publicly to something that carried enormous personal consequence. The fact that he showed up and told the truth, even knowing what it meant for his own reputation, is worth acknowledging. Whatever Susan did, Beverly Russell's abuse of her is a documented fact that belongs in any honest telling of this story. David Smith testified. He talked about his boys. He had divorced Susan the previous May. The divorce was finalized before the trial even began. He told the jury he believed Susan deserved the death penalty. On July 22nd, 1995, the jury found Susan Smith guilty on 2 counts of murder. The penalty phase began on July 24. After deliberation, the jury voted against the death penalty. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. When the sentence was announced, Susan reportedly collapsed in her chair. Whether that was relief, grief, shock, or some combination of all 3, nobody who was not in her mind in that moment can say.
Susan Smith has been in prison since July 1995. She was initially housed at the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia. In 2000, she was moved after 2 correctional officers pleaded guilty to having sexual encounters with her while she was incarcerated. She has been at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina ever since. Her disciplinary record inside is worth going through because it becomes relevant to the parole hearing, and because it tells you something about how she has navigated 30 years of incarceration. Susan Smith's disciplinary record, South Carolina Department of Corrections. 1997, found with a razor blade, contraband. 2000, 2 correctional officers charged following sexual encounters with Smith. She was moved facilities. 2012, disciplined for unauthorized use of another inmate's phone pin. 2015, disciplined for drug use. 2024, August, disciplined for communicating with a documentary filmmaker by phone, a violation of South Carolina prison rules prohibiting inmates from speaking with journalists. The incident report noted that Smith and the filmmaker had discussed the documentary, how she would be compensated, and details of the crime, including her original plan to jump from a bridge while holding the boys, abandoned when one of them woke up. Money was placed in her prison account as part of the arrangement. That last one, the documentary filmmaker, is something I need to sit with for a second, because it is not just a rule violation. The incident report says she discussed her original plan to jump from a bridge while holding the boys, but changed course because one of them woke up. That detail, that one of her sons was awake and aware, is something she had apparently not disclosed publicly before, and the context in which it came out was her negotiating a paid documentary deal. I find that detail genuinely difficult to process, and I think David Smith, who has attended every possible hearing and spent 30 years trying to make sure his boys are not forgotten, found it difficult too.
On November 20th, 2024, 30 years after Michael and Alex died in that lake, Susan Smith appeared via video link before the South Carolina Board of Paroles and Pardons. She was 53 years old. This was her first parole eligibility hearing. 471 people had written to the Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services about the hearing. 6 of those letters were in favor of her release. 465 were against it. Susan testified on her own behalf. She cried. She told the board she knew what she had done was horrible. She said, "I didn't lie to get away with it. I really didn't. I just did it because I was scared. I didn't know how to tell the people that loved them that they would never see them again." She said God had forgiven her. She asked the board to show the same mercy. I want to engage with that statement honestly, because I think it deserves a direct response. I didn't lie to get away with it. She fabricated a black carjacker. She gave a specific description. She sat on national television for 9 days and maintained that lie while the whole country searched for a man who did not exist, while black men in Union County were questioned and investigated based on her description. If that was not lying to get away with it, I genuinely do not know what it was. I understand that people can carry genuine remorse and still be capable of self-deception. But that particular statement at a parole hearing 30 years later, I think it is important to name it for what it is. Then David Smith addressed the board. He had driven to Columbia specifically for this. He had attended every possible proceeding related to this case for 30 years because he made a promise to himself that Michael and Alex would not be forgotten in any room where decisions were being made about Susan's future. He also told the board what she did, not only to Michael and Alex. She came pretty close to causing me to end my life because of the grief she brought upon me. 14 other witnesses opposed her parole. Former prosecutor Tommy Pope, now a South Carolina state legislator, was among them. He told reporters he did not believe Susan was genuinely remorseful for what she had done to Michael and Alex. She has been continually focused on Susan, he said, not on Michael and Alex. The board voted. Unanimous denial. According to reports, after the denial was communicated to her, Susan Smith threw a tantrum in her cell. And look,
I am going to be straight with you about how I feel about that, because I think you are thinking the same thing I am. She sat in front of that board and cried and said God had forgiven her and asked for mercy. And then when she did not get what she wanted, she threw a tantrum. I do not think I need to say anything more about that. The actions speak for themselves. Susan Smith's next parole eligibility hearing is November 2026.
Under South Carolina law, once eligible, she can appear before the board every 2 years. Former prosecutor Pope has already stated publicly he intends to be at every single one of those hearings. David Smith has said the same. I want to know what you think about this. 30 years in prison for the murder of 2 children. Unanimous parole denial. Next hearing in 2026. Do you think Susan Smith should ever be released? And I'm asking genuinely, not looking for an easy answer, because I think this case raises hard questions about punishment, about what prison is supposed to accomplish, and about whether remorse can be real when the self-interest is this visible. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Before we close, I want to say something that I think does not get said clearly enough when this case comes up. This is not just the story of a woman who killed her children to keep a man. It is that, but it is also the story of what happens when a system of people, a father who died by suicide, a stepfather who abused her for years, a church that harbored him, a series of relationships that ended in abandonment, leaves a person so damaged by the time they reach adulthood that they have no functional tools for managing loss. None of that is an excuse. Susan Smith made choices. Adults make choices. But the environment those choices came from was documented and ongoing and never adequately addressed. It is also the story of a calculated racial lie. The fabricated black carjacker was not random. It was a specific tool Susan Smith deployed because she knew it would work. And it did work. For 9 days, it worked perfectly. Hundreds of black men were investigated. A nationwide manhunt was conducted. The entire machinery of law enforcement was pointed in a direction that had nothing to do with the truth. That deserves to be named as clearly as the murders themselves. And it is the story of David Smith, a man who lost his 2 sons and then spent 30 years making sure they were not forgotten, who showed up at every hearing, who told every board and every reporter that 15 years per child is not enough, who has never stopped being their father, even though they have been gone since 1994. I think about David Smith a lot when I think about this case. He is the person in it who did not choose any of what happened to him. His sons were taken. His marriage had already fallen apart. He stood next to the person who killed his children for 9 days on national television, not knowing she had already done it. And then he has spent 30 more years showing up every time. I think that is a kind of love that deserves to be said out loud. Susan Smith is currently incarcerated at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina. She is 53 years old. Her next parole hearing is November 2026. Parole is granted to violent offenders in South Carolina approximately 8% of the time. Given the unanimous denial in 2024, the opposition from David Smith, former prosecutor Pope, and law enforcement, and her own disciplinary record, her chances are not strong. But the hearing will happen, and David Smith will be there. Beverly Russell, the stepfather who abused Susan from adolescence, died in 2010. He was 71 years old. Tom Findlay, the man whose letter arrived 8 days before the murders, has maintained an extremely low public profile since 1994. He has never sought any platform in connection with this case. He was never charged with anything. He sent a breakup letter. That is all he did. David Smith still lives in South Carolina. He remarried. He has spoken publicly about this case at almost every major milestone over 30 years. Not because he wanted attention, but because he made a decision that his boys would be remembered as people,
not just as part of a case file. John D. Long Lake is still there. The boat ramp is still there. People leave flowers sometimes. Michael Daniel Smith, 3 years old. October 10, 1991, October 25, 1994. Alexander Tyler Smith, 14 months old. August 5, 1993, October 25, 1994. That is all for today. Thanks for watching. Susan Smith's next parole hearing is November 2026, and I will be covering it here when it happens. The only way to make sure you catch that video is to subscribe right now with the bell on. This channel covers cases like this every single week. The full picture, the context that gets left out, the updates that matter. Not surface level, not sensational. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think she should ever be released? I want to know what you think. See you in the next one.